The day you stop rushing, life starts arriving on time. Carl Jung observed that the soul keeps a clock the ego cannot read, and every time we try to force the hour, we discover the clock was never on our wrist to begin with. Here is the line I want you to sit with before anything else. Jung wrote in a 1930 essay called The Stages of Life, collected in Collected Works, Volume 8, paragraph 784, that we cannot live the afternoon of life according to the program of life's morning. For what was great in the morning will be little at evening, and what in the morning was true will at evening have become a lie. And I want you to notice what that sentence is actually doing. It is not a comfort. It is an accusation aimed lovingly at the exact thing you have been doing all week. You have been running the morning's program through the afternoon's hours. You have been rushing a task that was never yours to hurry, because rushing is not a pace. Rushing is a refusal to admit the season has changed, and the ache you feel when your best efforts keep arriving late is not proof you are behind. It is proof you are still obeying an old schedule that expired without telling you. So here is where I want to meet you, not as a stranger with a theory, but as someone who has also sat at a desk at 11 at night, forcing a life to hurry. So let's say it together, out loud if you can. I stop treating my life like a delivery that is running late. I stop believing that if I just push harder, the good thing will finally show up on schedule. I ask instead what season I am actually standing in, and what that season is asking of me, instead of what I am demanding of it. Say it with me. I make the unconscious conscious. And again, I make the unconscious conscious. Before we go further, I would love for tomorrow's teaching to find you the same quiet way this one did, so if that's something you want, consider staying close by subscribing. If something in you just went still while I said that, if some old rushing finally exhaled, type the words "face it" in the comments, just those 2 words. Let it be the mark that you heard this one differently than you expected to. The first key is, the rushing is not your character. It is a leftover program running past its hour. And I want you to hear that distinction clearly, because most people mistake their hurry for their personality. They say, I have always been driven, I have always pushed, as if the pushing were carved into them at birth. But Jung would stop you right there and ask, driven by what program? Installed when? By whom? And for what season? Because a young person rushes to prove a life is possible, to build a name, a home, a foothold. And that rushing in the morning of life is not pathology, it is appropriate, it is even necessary. The trouble begins only when the same rushing keeps running long after the foothold is built, long after the name is made, long after the proving is done, and nobody sends a memo announcing that the season has turned. The body still floods with the old urgency. The calendar still fills the same way. The inbox still gets answered at the same panicked speed. But underneath it, something has gone hollow, because the program is answering a question life stopped asking years ago. Imagine a man who spent his 20s and 30s climbing, every promotion timed, every weekend sacrificed, and by 45 he has everything the program promised, and still he wakes at 5, rushing toward a day that has nothing left in it to rush toward. And notice what he actually does with that hollow feeling. He does not slow down to examine it. He reaches for more speed, because speed has become the only language his nervous system knows for being alive. He schedules a vacation and spends it answering messages. He sits with his children and mentally drafts tomorrow's agenda. He calls this discipline. He calls this ambition. But underneath the words, it is simply a morning program that never received the memo that morning ended years ago. And here is the part that matters most. This is not weakness, and it is not a character flaw to be ashamed of. It is a clock still ticking to an hour that has already passed. The fix is not more discipline. Discipline was never the problem. Timing was. So this week, notice one moment where you rush towards something and ask yourself plainly, is this the young part of me still proving something? Or is this the actual shape of what today requires? Let that question sit unanswered if it must, and let it be the whole practice for now. I release the hurry that belongs to a season I have already finished. The second key is, the clock you keep breaking against was never a deadline, it was a season. And I want to slow down here, because this distinction is easy to nod along with and almost impossible to actually live by. A deadline is a human invention. It can be moved, argued with, extended if you find the right person to ask. But a season answers to nothing you can negotiate. A season simply completes itself in its own time, the way winter does not shorten because you are cold. And Jung's whole map of the second half of life rests on exactly this difference. He taught that a human life has a morning and an afternoon, and that each one carries a different assignment. The morning's assignment is to build, to secure a place in the world, to earn a name, to construct what he called the persona, the practical mask that lets you function among other people. And there is nothing false or shameful in this work. It is honest labor, and it is necessary. But the afternoon does not ask you to keep building the same structure taller. The afternoon turns inward and asks a completely different question. Not what more can I acquire, but what in me has gone unlived while I was busy acquiring. And here is the trouble. No one rings a bell when the morning ends. There is no ceremony, no letter in the mail. So people keep sprinting the first assignment straight through the second, and then wonder why the sprinting produces less and less of what it used to. Imagine a man who spent every year from 25 to 55 treating each new goal like a deadline. The promotion, the house, the number in the account, and each time he hit one, he immediately set the next. Faster, because that pace was proven. That pace had always worked. And then one ordinary Thursday, he closes the biggest deal of his career, and instead of the relief he expected, he feels almost nothing, and that night he can't sleep. Not from excitement, from a strange, flat disappointment he can't name, because he is still running a morning's race, in an afternoon that no longer wants a race at all. It wants attention turned inward, and no deadline, however cleverly hit, can satisfy a season asking for something else entirely. This is why forcing an early arrival so often feels hollow, even when it succeeds. You can hit a deadline through sheer will, but you cannot will a season to finish sooner. The season simply is not that kind of thing. And here is the strange comfort inside this key. If you keep missing your own schedule, that is not evidence of failure. It may be evidence that you are, for the first time, up against something honest, something that will not be bullied the way a deadline can. So this week, take one thing you keep treating like a deadline, a relationship that should already feel resolved, a change you think should already have happened, and ask plainly, is this actually late? Or am I simply reading an afternoon against a morning's ruler? I let the season, not the clock, tell me the truth. The third key is, every arrival you force before its hour becomes a debt against the afternoon that is coming, whether you're ready or not. And I want to walk through this slowly, because it is the part people resist hearing most. We like to imagine that forcing things simply costs us nothing but effort. That if we push hard enough and the thing arrives early, we've won. We've beaten the clock. But Jung's understanding of the psyche does not allow for a free lunch of that kind. What is not lived consciously does not vanish. It goes into the ledger, and the ledger comes due. To consider what it actually means to force an arrival. You take something that needed a season to ripen, and you manufacture the appearance of ripeness through sheer will. A career milestone you weren't emotionally ready to hold. A marriage entered because the calendar said it was time. A public image of having arrived that outpaced the private truth of still becoming. And for a while it works, because forcing is a kind of magic trick. It produces the shape of the thing without the substance underneath it. But the unlived part of the process does not simply disappear because you skipped it. It waits, patiently, in exactly the place Jung called the unconscious. And later, often at the worst possible moment, it presents its bill. Think of it the way a farmer would think of forced fruit. You can pick an apple green and hard, and call it harvested. You can even sell it, hold it up, and say, see, I have my harvest early, but the sourness is still in it. The sugar never finished forming, and no amount of pride in the picking changes what the first bite reveals. This is what a forced arrival always is. The outer shape without the inner sweetness. And the tragedy is that from the outside it can look identical to the real thing. The promotion looks the same on paper, whether you were ready to hold its weight or not. The marriage certificate reads the same, whether the two people inside it had actually finished becoming who they needed to be for each other. Only later, quietly, does the difference show itself. Let me walk you through an ordinary week, the way this actually happens. Monday, you push a decision through before you've actually settled it inwardly. Tuesday, you accept praise for a version of yourself that isn't quite true yet. Wednesday, you skip the private reckoning because there isn't time. Thursday, you feel a strange irritability you can't place. Friday, you snap at someone who did nothing to deserve it. And by Sunday night, you are lying awake with a hollow feeling you cannot name. And that hollow feeling is the ledger, quietly recording every arrival you forced before its hour. Notice, too, how the debt rarely announces itself as a debt. It disguises itself as fatigue that sleep doesn't fix, as a success that should feel like relief, but instead feels like static, as a relationship that looks finished on the outside, while something inside it still quietly waits to be built. This is what Jung meant when he wrote in that same essay that we ruin ourselves treating the evening of life as though it were the morning. We are not ruined by failure. We are ruined by success that arrived too early for the soul that was supposed to carry it. And here is the mercy hidden in this key. The debt is not a punishment, it is an invitation. It is the unconscious politely insisting that the parts of you left behind still deserve to be lived. It is never too late to go back and finish paying attention to what you skipped. The ledger does not close. It only waits for you to open it honestly. So this week, notice one place where you've been proud of arriving early, and ask honestly whether the private, unglamorous part of that process actually happened, or whether you skipped straight to the appearance of the result. I let each thing take the time it actually needs to become true. The fourth key is, the unlived life keeps its own appointment book, and it does not consult you about the hour, it simply arrives, and this is perhaps the hardest thing to accept about timing. Because we like to imagine that if we ignore a part of ourselves long enough, it quietly retires, gives up, stops asking. But Jung observed the opposite is true. What is unlived does not become smaller with neglect. It becomes denser, and it keeps a schedule of its own that eventually overrides yours, whether you are ready or not. Think of the retired businessman Jung described, a man who had organized his entire identity around competence and control, who built an empire of decisions and deadlines, and who collapsed the moment retirement removed the structure, holding the unlived parts of him at bay. All his life he had an appointment book crowded with meetings, and not one line reserved for the parts of himself that never got to speak. And when the meetings stopped, those parts did not politely wait for a more convenient decade. They arrived all at once, uninvited, exactly on their own schedule. And this is the pattern behind so many collapses that look sudden from the outside, but were never sudden at all. They were simply an appointment that had been on the book the whole time, unread. Now imagine a quieter version of this same appointment book. Not a collapse, just an ordinary Sunday afternoon. A woman finishes cleaning a house that did not need cleaning, sits down for the first time all week, and within minutes, feels a restlessness she cannot explain. So she gets up again, finds another task, because stillness has become the 1 hour she cannot keep. And if you asked her what she is avoiding, she would say nothing. She would say she is simply productive. But what is actually happening is that the moment the outer schedule empties, an older, unscheduled appointment tries to step forward. A grief never finished, a question about her own life never asked, a creative hunger set aside decades ago, and she keeps rebooking the meeting room with dishes and errands because some part of her already knows who is waiting on the other side of the stillness. This is not laziness, and it is not busyness either. It is the ego running from an appointment it did not choose but cannot cancel. And I think of the popular phrase floating around that life begins at 40, which people love to quote as though it were Jung's insight. It is not. That phrase belongs to a writer named Walter Pitkin from 1932, and the modern idea of a midlife crisis as a fixed event on a fixed date comes from a psychologist named Elliot Yax in 1965. Neither of these captures what Jung actually taught, which is quieter and far less convenient. There is no universal hour stamped on every calendar. There is only your own unlived life, keeping its own private appointment book, one page glowing, while the rest sit in shadow. And it will not be rushed into arriving sooner just because you are finally ready to look. Nor will it wait forever if you keep refusing the meeting. The only real choice you have is not whether the appointment comes, but whether you walk into that room on your own 2 feet or get pulled through the door by circumstance. I am willing to keep the appointment my own depths have already made. Before the 5th key, I want to pause and say this plainly. If this way of listening to your own timing is new to you, staying close by subscribing means the next teaching finds you when you need it, and I would genuinely love for that to happen. So if you're willing, stay. The 5th key is, and this is the deepest one, so let's take it slowly, in pieces, because the whole shape of this teaching comes to rest here. First, consider that individuation itself, the lifelong process Jung called coming to selfhood, has never once been a race. It is not a project with a finish line you can sprint toward. It is closer to the slow ripening of fruit on a tree that does not care how badly you want the fruit today. Jung wrote of this coming to selfhood as a task with, in his words, a significance of its own, meaning it is not measured against anyone else's timeline, not your parents, not your peers, not the version of you that scrolls past achievements that look faster than yours. And here is what that means practically. When you compare your unfolding to someone else's, you are comparing 2 different trees in 2 different soils under 2 different skies, and expecting them to fruit on the same afternoon. The second, consider what happens the moment you actually stop forcing the fruit. And I don't mean stop trying. I mean stop treating every open question in your life as an emergency requiring an answer by tonight. Because there is a particular kind of exhaustion that comes only from holding a question by force, gripping it, demanding it resolve before its material has finished arriving. And there is a completely different quality of attention available the moment you let a question simply exist without strangling it for an answer. This is not passivity. Jung was careful never to mistake patience for laziness. He meant something closer to what he elsewhere called holding the tension between what is not yet ready and what you wish were already settled, and staying inside that tension long enough for something true to form, rather than manufacturing a false resolution just to relieve the discomfort of waiting. Imagine, for a moment, an ordinary Tuesday built entirely around this second piece. You wake and immediately reach for your phone to check whether the thing you're waiting on has resolved. It hasn't. You feel a flicker of dread. You rush through breakfast rehearsing arguments for a decision that isn't actually due today. You arrive at work and make 3 small decisions faster than necessary just to feel a sense of forward motion. By lunch, you're irritated at a colleague for a delay that has nothing to do with your real waiting. By evening, you're scrolling for distraction because sitting with the unresolved question feels unbearable, and you fall asleep, having spent every hour of that day avoiding one simple fact, that the answer was not ready, and no amount of manufactured urgency was going to make it ready faster. And the strange part is, this same Tuesday repeats itself for weeks without you noticing. Because forcing disguises itself as productivity, it looks like effort, it looks like care, but underneath it is only the same old refusal wearing a busier coat. Third, consider what actually happens on the rare day you don't do any of that. The day you wake, notice the same unresolved question, and instead of gripping it, you simply say, "Not yet." And let that be enough. Something shifts, not because the outer situation has changed, but because you have stopped adding your own manufactured emergency on top of an already difficult wait. The question is still open, the wanting is still warm, but the frantic edge around it has gone quiet. And in that quiet, you notice things you couldn't notice before. A conversation you'd been avoiding. A small correction you'd been too rushed to make. A version of the answer that had actually been forming for weeks while you were busy demanding it arrive faster. Now picture a different kind of ordinary person. Someone spending evenings writing something long. A book, a letter she has rewritten a dozen times. a story she cannot make land, and for months she forces the ending, bolting one conclusion after another onto pages that resist every one of them. Each attempt reads false the moment she reads it back, flat, hurried, borrowed from somewhere else. And one evening, worn out from forcing, she simply closes the notebook without finishing, and does something else entirely. Washes dishes, walks outside, lets the unfinished page sit exactly where it is, and 3 nights later, without warning, while she is thinking about nothing in particular, the true ending arrives whole, not built, but recognized, as though it had been waiting nearby the entire time for the noise of her forcing to finally quiet down enough for it to be heard. This is not luck, and it is not magic. It is the same rhythm Jung watched in his patients for decades. The material was never missing, only her grip on it was in the way. Fourth, consider the deeper reason this works the way it does. Jung observed across decades of clinical work that the things people forced almost never turned out to be the things they actually needed, while the things they were patient enough to let ripen arrived, again and again, exactly resourced for the moment they finally appeared. And this is not because some outside force was rewarding the patience. It is because the waiting itself was doing quiet work you couldn't see, integrating, preparing, aligning the parts of you that would eventually need to carry the thing once it arrived. Think of it as a kind of underground construction. Nothing visible above ground for a long stretch, and then, seemingly overnight, a structure that could only have been built by everything that came before it. The patient farmer does not stand over the seed accusing it of laziness. The farmer waits because the farmer understands that the soil is doing the very thing it was always going to do, quietly, without needing to be watched. And this is exactly what Jung meant when he described the psyche's own rhythm, a rhythm that does not accelerate under pressure, it only hides deeper. Fifth, and this is worth sitting with longest, notice that the very impatience you feel is itself information, not a flaw to suppress, but a signal to read correctly, because impatience almost always means one of two things. Either you are standing at a threshold that truly is ready, and you are simply afraid to walk through it, or you are standing before a door that has not yet finished forming, and you are mistaking its stillness for your failure. And the only way to tell the difference is the same way you would test any door. Gently, without kicking it, you return to the question the next morning and the next. Not gripping, only checking, present without demanding. And slowly, the door itself begins to tell you which kind it is. Because a ready door opens at the lightest touch, and an unready one simply asks, again, for the one thing forcing can never buy, which is more time inside the dark where it is still being made. So, if you are in a season right now where something feels overdue, where you keep checking the clock and finding it insultingly slow, I want you to consider the possibility that the clock is not broken, that what looks late by the calendar you inherited may in fact be arriving in the only order the soul can actually receive it. First the readiness, quietly, unglamorously, built in rooms nobody applauds, and only then the arrival, standing exactly at the threshold prepared to hold it. And this is worth saying plainly, because it changes how you spend tonight. The readiness is not separate from the waiting. The readiness is what the waiting was quietly building the entire time. I stop mistaking my impatience for my clock, and I let the true clock keep its own hours. The sixth key is, on time was never late, and I want to leave you with this because it is the quiet resolution underneath everything we've walked through together. The thing you have been calling lateness, the ache of watching a life you wanted still not arrive, was never actually a verdict on your worth or your effort. It was a mismeasurement. You were reading an afternoon against a morning's ruler. And no ruler, built for one season, will ever give you an honest reading of another. And let me make this ordinary for a moment. Imagine someone who applied for something that mattered, a job, a program, a chance they had quietly built their hope around, and every afternoon they walk to the mailbox before the mail has even come. They check twice. They check again after dinner. They lie awake certain that silence means rejection. And then weeks later, the answer arrives exactly when the process required it to arrive. Not a day sooner, Not because anyone was punishing the wait, but because the actual work of deciding was still happening somewhere they couldn't see. And here is what nobody tells that person standing at the mailbox. The checking did not slow the letter down, but it did steal every one of those afternoons from being lived. This is what rushing quietly does. It does not usually change the hour of arrival. It simply empties the waiting of its own worth. Jung's whole teaching on the stages of life comes down, in the end, to a kind of respect. Respect for the fact that a life has its own architecture, its own sequence, its own honest pace, and that the rushing we do is almost always love in a disguise we don't recognize. Love for the life we want so badly, we try to drag it toward us before it's finished becoming itself. And I think if Jung were sitting across from you tonight, he would not tell you to stop wanting. He would ask you gently to stop confusing wanting with hurrying, to let the wanting stay warm while you let the hurrying finally rest. Because the moment you stop rushing is not the moment you give up on the life you wanted. It is the moment that life, quietly, without announcement, without applause, finally has room to arrive on its own honest schedule, exactly as it was always going to, and exactly on time. So tonight, if you find yourself at the mailbox of your own life, checking twice, checking again, let this be the small practice. Set the checking down once, just once, and let the hour keep itself. I stop checking the mailbox, and let the hour keep itself. Here is the whole picture. The rushing was a morning program still running past its hour. The clock you kept breaking against was a season, not a deadline. Every forced arrival left a debt the afternoon eventually collects. The unlived life keeps its own appointment book regardless of yours. Patience is not passivity. It is holding a question long enough for the true answer to finish forming. And on time was never late. These were never 6 separate keys. They were 6 turns of the same single key. The recognition that your life has its own honest clock, and that the ache of waiting was never a sign it had forgotten you. So say it with me once more. I stop rushing what still needs its season. I let the true clock, not my fear, keep the hours. I make the unconscious conscious. And if there is one place life feels late tonight, let this be the question you carry gently into sleep. What if it isn't late at all? What if it is simply, finally, arriving on time?